Tentor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Anti-Oligarchy Constitution, Reconstructing the Economic Foundations of American Democracy, by Joseph Fishkin and William E. Forbath. Narrated by Daniel Henning. Introduction. Our constitutional system is headed for a historic confrontation. As in the 1930s, the elected branches of the federal government face an immediate crisis. Then, the Depression, now the economic devastation wrought by a pandemic, that has laid bare and exacerbated a slower burning crisis of growing economic and political inequality. Most Americans understand, if sometimes in an inchoate way, that this crisis of inequality threatens our democracy. When too much economic and political power is concentrated in too few hands, what you have is not democracy, but oligarchy. Prominent voices now speak openly of oligarchy in this country. Yet, it remains possible to change course, to reshape the nation's political economy and disperse economic and political power more broadly among all the people. As we write these words, liberals and progressives in the elected branches of the federal government are beginning to do this work. They hope to enact measures to distribute both wealth and political power more broadly among all the people. More decent jobs, public investment, and social insurance. More clout for ordinary Americans in politics and in the labor market. More taxing and breaking up concentrated wealth. But as in the 1930s, liberal and progressive lawmakers confront a very conservative federal judiciary that is deeply hostile to exactly this sort of legislation. It is a judiciary put in place by a political party with a weakening grip on power, but a growing determination to thwart legislation and sustain minority rule by translating its vision of political economy into constitutional law. The phrase political economy is essential for understanding the present crisis. It is an old way of thinking that is becoming new again. Before the 20th century rise of economics as a discipline, thinkers as varied as Adam Smith, John Stuart Mill, and Karl Marx understood economics and politics as inseparable. These political economists studied such subjects as wages, prices, labor and capital, the distribution of wealth, and the distribution of political power. They observed how political decisions shape and constitute market and property relations, and thereby shape the distribution of wealth and power. And they observed how economic relations and economic power shape politics. As long as political economy flourished, Americans of all political stripes viewed and argued about the Constitution through a political economy lens, and the political economy through a constitutional lens. In the 20th century, economics supplanted political economy. It aspired to a more scientific, technocratic approach and a narrower focus. It sidelined questions about the distribution of wealth and political power. 20th century liberals gradually embraced the technocratic promise of economics and abandoned their traditions of political economy, although conservatives never did. Confronting the present crisis will require liberals and progressives to reclaim many of their older arguments about political economy and enact policies and laws that implement them. This is work for the elected branches. Much of the work is federal legislation, and nearly all of it is vulnerable to constitutional attacks by an emboldened conservative political and legal movement that aims, as its predecessors did a century ago, to elevate an anti-redistributive vision of political economy into constitutional arguments to be enforced in court. In the looming constitutional confrontation, the democratically elected branches have some tools and methods of their own, which they can and likely will use to challenge, defy, or threaten the courts, pushing back against judges' constitutional and statutory claims. But in the name of what? General theories of democracy? A broad vision of congressional power? precedent and stare decisis to protect old holdings won in prior rounds of this same conflict, such as the battle over the New Deal. There is room for all these arguments, although each has real limitations. But there's also something else. There is an American tradition of constitutional argument that directly addresses the central problems of oligarchy and inequality we now face. That tradition is the subject of this book. Throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, generations of reformers argued that America was becoming a society with a moneyed aristocracy, or a ruling class, an oligarchy, not a republic. These reformers were making constitutional claims. For them, circumstances resembling America's today, in which too much economic and political power is concentrated in the hands of the few, pose not just an economic, social, or political problem, but a constitutional problem. We call this tradition the democracy of opportunity tradition. It is as old as the Republic itself. But we take the name from President Franklin Roosevelt, who argued that it was a constitutional necessity to overthrow the economic royalists and build a democracy of opportunity for all Americans in the economic and the political spheres. Arguments in the democracy of opportunity tradition hold, broadly, that we cannot keep our constitutional democracy, our republican form of government, without 1. Restraints against oligarchy, and 2. A political economy that sustains a robust middle class, open and broad enough to accommodate everyone. The most important and compelling arguments in this tradition hold that 3. A constitutional principle of inclusion across lines such as race and sex is inseparable from the first 2 requirements and equally necessary for sustaining the political economy that Republican government demands. Constitutional politics. Building that kind of political economy requires legislation. That is exactly what advocates working in the democracy of opportunity tradition argued the Constitution demanded. They held that the Constitution imposed affirmative obligations on all branches of government, but especially on the elected branches, to pass and implement the legislation needed to enforce the Constitution. Often, they insisted the most important role for courts was to get out of the way of such legislation. Many Americans today view the Constitution as essentially a set of limits on government, enforced almost exclusively by courts. This book argues that it is time to reclaim a different way of thinking about the Constitution, one that made the democracy of opportunity tradition possible. Recovering this tradition involves recovering a different understanding of what a constitutional claim is, what it sounds like, to whom it is addressed, and how it relates to politics. It is conventional today, especially among liberals, to assume that the only real constitutional claims are the ones enforceable in court. From that perspective, constitutional claims are political conversation stoppers. They constrain and set the boundaries of politics. One of the core aims of this book is to help listeners see beyond those assumptions. Americans making arguments in the democracy of opportunity tradition through most of American history did not view their constitutional arguments, or, for that matter, those of their opponents, as outside constraints on democratic politics. Instead, they were the substance of democratic constitutional politics. The participants in these debates often argued about the affirmative constitutional duties of legislatures and executives. They saw that the political branches were crucial fora in which constitutional conflicts and deliberations unfolded. Far from being conversation stoppers, constitutional claims were central to great national political debates about the relationship between the Constitution and the nation's economic and political life. Why have arguments about the Constitution played this special role in our politics? Although any answer to this question is necessarily speculative, we think the best answer goes something like this. Constitutional politics is how generations of Americans championed and challenged Major Structural Economic Reforms.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?